to the New York Times denouncing them as murderers. And, of course, then they didn't play his music in Russia for decades. He had this dour aspect, and Stravinsky once called him a 6.5-foot scowl. He presented a very dour image to the public, and he was always before the public because he played umpteen million concerts with orchestra. He was a very busy and successful musician. He had an apartment on West End Avenue, and then he was buried in upstate New York. But whether he loved New York or not is unknown. But he had to be here for career reasons. You know, all the money was in New York.
2 decades after the Russian influx, a second wave of exiled musicians and composers began to arrive in New York. This time they came from mainland Europe, escaping the rise in anti-Semitism from Germany. Their work had been labelled Entartete Musik, or degenerate music, by the new fascist regime. But this was just the kind of music the melting pot of New York in the 1930s wanted to absorb into the mix. Classical record producer Michael Haas.
Once you got into the United States, if you could find a job, you could have it. So it meant that New York found itself full of voice coaches, language coaches, repetiteurs, souffleurs who were prompters in the opera house, endless composition teachers, theory teachers. And, you know, there were a number of composers who came in and thought, oh, I've made it, you know, I'm here to stay. But the only one who really made it in New York was Kurt Weill.
If you're bent on viewing something doing, come to Florence.
He was able to get himself onto Broadway. He was a musical theater composer already from Berlin, so the genre of American musical theater wasn't that far away. What Kurt Weill brought, which was unique, was a reinvention of American musical theater. It came with an edge that it hadn't had before.
In New York, there's an uptown and a downtown music scene. Uptown is formal, the cluster of buildings and institutions strewn across the Upper West Side: Carnegie Hall, the Juilliard School, Columbia University, and the Metropolitan Opera. This is the world of the European classical repertoire, canonical scores and master composers. Downtown is experimental, noisy, informal, and with far fewer boundaries. British composer Rodney Bennett has lived and worked in New York for decades.
The moment I got out of the taxi, actually, I remember it quite clearly. I was at home. I was one of quite a small number of composers who were influenced by the European avant-garde, which meant I automatically moved into a circle that was very close to my heart at that time. It was thrilling, but also it was, of course, the home of modern jazz, which was my other great interest, so it was like being in heaven for me.
There obviously was at some point a massive divide between the so-called uptown music and downtown music.
I always understood uptown music to be a world away from downtown music, which is basically anything goes, and it has to do with the Lower East Side and improvisation.
I think you're right. Despite living on the Upper West Side, I think you're a downtown composer. Downtown music composer, would you say?
No. I'm my own composer. And the fact that I have been involved with jazz and with the European avant-garde, I'm not categorizable.
But even the physical idea of downtown is a loose one, extending from Lower Manhattan with its bars and hybrid concert venues right over the East River into Brooklyn. Although an expensive place to live now, Brooklyn Heights, hugging the East River just south of the Brooklyn Bridge, was the first downtown overflow. Local historian Sherill Tippins has chronicled the story of 7 Middow Street, once home to a rather glamorous but volatile group of artists that included British composer Benjamin Britten and his friend and collaborator W.H. Auden. They were joined by fellow composer Paul Bowles, the author Carson McCullers, and burlesque stripper-turned-crime fiction writer Gypsy Rose Lee.
So you can imagine trying to compose music in this house. You had typewriters clattering on the top floor and on the next floor. Then you had downstairs in the basement Paul Bowles trying to compose his music and play his music for Broadway, and noise everywhere. And in this atmosphere, Benjamin Britten had to try to think about the origins of America and write American music on commission. It was almost impossible.
American composer Phillip Ramey.
I happen to think Benjamin Britten was one of the great 20th century composers, and Paul was quite opposed to that view. He didn't like that music at all. And he told me, living in that house, he found Britten to be very irritating. The crux of the matter was there were two pianos in that house, and one was a grand piano on one of the higher floors, probably in the parlor, and one was a little upright, out-of-tune upright, in the dank basement. Well, guess which piano Auden assigned to Paul Bowles? So Benji Britten got the good piano, and Paul never forgave him for that. And he said they weren't friendly at all. He considered Britten arrogant and uninteresting as a person and as a composer, right from the horse's mouth. Of course, I didn't agree with him at all about the music, but everyone's entitled to his wrong opinion.
So, Britten, living here in Mid-Oz Street, desperate for money, is drawn to Broadway. He thinks he might be able to write the great American musical, very much influenced by Kurt Weill. Interestingly, not an American composer, but an émigré composer. What were the fruits of that?
Paul Bunyan began as a suggestion from their publisher that they create an operetta that could be performed in the schools. So there are a lot of sort of happy-go-lucky, naive-sounding pieces in it because it was written for students. And then they suddenly thought that they had an opportunity for Broadway, so they changed the style again, and he tried to put in a lot of Broadway tunes, and these were influenced by Kurt Weill. And I think the influence of Kurt Weill was mainly that he was an émigré and he had made it on Broadway, so that was very inspiring to Britten. And so he wanted to do what Weill had done. So he did. He put in some Broadway tunes.
You must believe me when I speak. He gave 3, 4, 6 pounds every week. He grew so fast.
From where I live on the Upper West Side, I can see the passenger terminal on the eastern bank of the Hudson River. Today it's a large dock for transatlantic ocean liners, but in Benjamin Britten's day it was a smaller, dirtier, more anonymous affair. I do think of Britten in 1942 on board the Axel Johnson, a rough Swedish cargo ship sailing out of the Hudson past the Statue of Liberty and back to England. Unlike Dvorak, he never located America's symphonic soul. Unlike Kurt Weill, he never got his Broadway musical off the ground, and his performances and concert music hadn't really set the New York music scene alight as it had been by Rachmaninoff's work. Maybe it was only as the skyscrapers receded into the distance from the safety of his berth and with the sound of the waves lapping against the ship that Britten finally felt the power of his New World muse. In a flash of inspiration, he wrote on the boat one of his most cherished works, Ceremony of Carols, and he also finished one of his last collaborations with Auden, whom he'd left behind in Brooklyn, the Hymn to St. Cecilia. The words of this last piece make me think of all those composers who, before me, were lured across the Atlantic to this siren city. Appear in visions to all musicians, appear and inspire. Come down and startle, composing mortals with immortal fire.
Composing New York was presented by Tarik O'Regan and produced by Simon Hollis. It was a Brooke Lapping production for BBC.